All right, so one of the questions that we get frequently asked all the time at our shop is, guy comes in with a recurve, what's the best arrow for me? I wrote an article about it. I told, like all my employees, have the customers read that. Turns out people don't like reading, so we're gonna look at kind of my formula, the formula that Joe uses, and this is a very basic guide to choosing your arrow. So I had a video yesterday. We went over my chart here. This is basically how to choose a beginner recurve arrow. I screwed up big time. I mean, not only was the video 30 plus minutes, I was not wearing a flannel shirt. So all of my information was invalidated, and I figured I'd give it another go today. Okay, here at the shop, we have a ton of recurve sales, and I would say the vast majority of people are beginners. Whether they got the ball off of us, whether they got it somewhere else, garage sale, whatever, brought it in. One of the main points of confusion for customers is going to be which arrow to choose. And when you are new to archery, the important thing to note when you're new to traditional archery of any kind, longbow, recurve, ILF, whatever, get an arrow that's good enough. Practice your form. So I got a list of frequently asked questions here that kind of can stump some people up. So we're gonna kind of put those to rest here. Let me grab my board. First one that trips people up: what is the best arrow for me? Next question we get a lot of: how long should my arrows be? A lot of people get hung up on that. I just got a recurve. I want a bare shaft tune. Ton of those people are coming in right now. And then this one kind of includes the other ones, but it's how much weight should I run up front? What should my insert weigh, and what should my field tip weigh? So just to kind of put all these questions to rest, I made a chart that is going to easily explain kind of how I go about choosing that arrow for that beginner recurve archer, longbow archer, whatever. As long as they're traditional, this is kind of my method for choosing their arrows. So up until yesterday, this chart actually only existed in my head. We had a cool idea for the video. We're like, hey, let's put it up on a whiteboard, make it a little bit easier. That way I could point to things. And I actually really like this chart. This is something where it's been in my head, Joe's head, and I know Tyler's starting to get he's getting real proficient with tuning the recurve. So this is kind of something that's been in our heads, but we've decided to take it and put it out on somewhere where you can see it and read it and interact with it. So left side of my board here, beginners. This is going to cover a lot more of you than you would expect. I would say this is probably going to cover about 80% of shooters, your backyard plinkers, anybody if you're not hunting, and in some cases if you are hunting, just depending on how well your arrows fly, most of you guys are going to be able to stay on this side of the chart here. This is just beginner information, and this is going to get you a good enough arrow to where you can focus on what really matters, that being your form. Right side, I get a little bit more in the weeds with it. I get a little bit more complex. I consider a bunch of different factors, and you can choose to play with that or not. And then it's something where you could buy an arrow from just this information over here. Come back to the video when you do start to bare shaft tune. There's a lot of good videos about bare shaft tuning out there. And then you can start to consult some of this information over here. Okay, first side here. This is just a basic layout of poundages along with a number system that I have kind of assigned to the different spines of arrows. So left column here, that's your bow poundage, and I just did it by 10-pound increments. You can figure out the in-betweens. Arrow spine column over here. So it is assumed that this is on a 32-inch shaft. The important thing to know about this video is it is general. We are talking about beginners. We are talking about just basic arrows, standard diameter arrows, because as soon as you start getting into micro, small diameter, it gets a little bit hairy. So we're talking about standard diameter arrows, gold tip arrows, gold tip diameter arrows. So we're talking warriors, hunters, velocities, Easton Legacies, Easton Bowhunter 6.5, standard diameter arrows only. And then, you can use the same theories, but The important thing is this is kind of just a catch-all. So keep that in mind. We have standardized a couple of variables. So 32-inch shaft is assumed. Standard components are assumed. So that's going to be your stock inserts, whatever comes with it, 10 to 12 grain aluminum insert and 100 grains of field point weight. So these are the poundages that I've kind of lined up here. You're talking 30 pound bows. I see them shooting pretty well with 700 spine arrows. 40 pound bows, 600 spine, 50 to 500s, and then 60 pound bows, 400s. For me, if you're shooting a bow that's 50 to 60 pounds, somewhere in there, and you are new to recurve archery, you should highly consider getting a lower poundage bow. This chart only works if you are practicing good form. And when I say good form, I'm talking about drawing to alignment, I'm talking about anchoring, I'm talking about building back tension as you slowly relax your fingers, making a strongly executed shot. I'm not talking about the Lars Andersons, the James Jeans, the Byron Fergusons. That is a completely different style of shooting. And I'm not talking about horsebow shooting, I'm talking about you have a shelf, just that kind of form, just so I'm clear with that. I have a number system over here, so this is going to be, I would consider them spine categories. So if you're, let's say we're at a 700 spine, I would say going up one spine category would take you to a 600. And the reason that I say up is because I think of it as stiffness. I mean, it is stiffness, so I think of it as increasing stiffness. Basically what spine is the amount an arrow bends over a certain length with a certain amount of weight. It's the deflection of the arrow. So that is a measurement of how much the arrow deflects. The smaller the number gets, the stiffer the arrow is. So that's going to be better for the higher poundage recurves. So with this is plenty of information to get a beginner set up just right out the bat. Now, if you are considering hunting, I would strongly suggest, I would pretty much almost mandate brass inserts. So whatever that comes, whatever you can get standard components for your arrows, whether it's 75, 100 brass, 50 brass, whatever it is, throw the most brass that you can, which is going to take this chart and bump you down or up in one stiffness. So down the number chart or up in one stiffness. So that's going to make your arrow fly a little bit weaker, but it's also going to add mass weight, so you get a little bit better penetration with that, and it's going to be more of a suitable hunting arrow. So, hunters, non-hunters, whoever, you can pretty much stay to this side of the chart here, the left side of the chart, and do just fine. This will carry you for a long time while you're getting your form down and while you're learning how to shoot. Where things start to get a little bit more fuzzy, where I kind of start diving into that rabbit hole a little bit, right side of the chart here. So if you are, if you know what it's like to tinker with arrows, if you're a compound guy and you know how to build arrows, you know the commitment that this kind of study takes. So this is a lot of trial and error here. This is where you have started to bare shaft tune. You have started to play with your arrows, play with point weights, just to get a little bit better arrow flight. These are different factors that you're going to want to consider when you're looking at your arrows. So I have on the left here just a list of things that are going to make you want to shoot a stiffer arrow. On the right here is going to be all the things that I think are going to make you require, or your bow require, a weaker arrow. So over here, brass insert, I kind of went over that. Just anytime you're adding, I say like 75 to 100 grains up front, you are going to jump one stiffness in spine. So that's going to put you, let's say, from a 600 to a 500. Springy rest plunger, anything to offset that inward motion of the arrow after a finger release, that's going to be a little bit more forgiving. You're going to be able to shoot a stiffer arrow. Long jaw lengths. Every 50 grains, I would consider that about a half a stiffness. So if you had 100 grains, that's a full stiffness. So a couple things to consider when you're thinking about arrow spine. Over here, your center cut is a big one. If you're shooting a Samick Sage, anything like that with a little bit of a less than center cut, that is going to require you to shoot a little bit of a weaker arrow to get a good tune out of it. If you're not sure what center cut is, look it up. There's a bunch of videos. You can look it up in your manual, I'm sure, your manufacturer's manual, just to determine what center cut is and what your bow is. This is kind of a big one too. So every 2 inches shorter that you get on your arrow shaft, I find, and this is a pretty general one, this varies from arrow to arrow, I find typically you're gonna have to go up or down one stiffness and arrow. So for example, you're at a 600 spine right now, assumed 32-inch draw length. Now if they only make, sorry, arrow length. If they only make a 600 spine in 30 inches, that's gonna mean that you might wanna consider going down to that 700 spine, because the shorter the length, the stiffer that arrow is gonna become dynamically. Just as a quick visual, I like to show people this at the shop. You have a full length arrow here, you bend it, that can bend a ton. You shorten the length of the arrow, that's not gonna bend nearly as much. So that's just a quick visual demonstration of why that kind of works the way it does. String silencers, they can either matter a little or a lot, depending on which ones you have. If you have cat whiskers on there, like little tiny trimmed up cat whiskers, probably not going to affect it much. If you have big wool puffs, I've even seen a couple people running a couple wool puffs, that is going to slow your bow down like crazy. You're going to want to shoot a weaker arrow to make up for it. Lastly, over here, B55 string. So that's going to be a more organic, it's a Dacron based material. It eats a lot of the snap of the bow. So as opposed to D97, 452X, 8125, those are high performance materials that are high performance. They're going to put all that energy into the arrow. This eats up a little bit of that energy, so that might kind of lean you towards getting a weaker arrow as well. So like I said, this is kind of, it's a little bit more advanced. Get into it or not. I have found that this works with some pretty high level setups too. So this isn't just for beginners. Feel free to use this as a reference as you are bear shaft tuning too. So use it, get your form down, start your bear shaft tune. You might even be able to stick with the same arrows that you got because of this chart over here. One of the things that I like to tell people when they're buying arrows, I always say by week, use Kimsha. So that's down right here. Reason I say by week, you get a full length shaft, you're going to be able to affect that dynamic spine tremendously more by cutting it down. Now I'm at a 28.5 inch draw length. Usually if I start with a full length shaft, I'm able to cut 6 inches off of an arrow if I need to. So that is going to give me a lot more wiggle room than if I were to buy stiff and then just have to keep adding point weight, because there is a limit to the amount of point weight that you can add. It's not hard and fast, but you don't want to end up shooting a 250 grain broadhead just to get your bow to tune right, and then you're forced to buy iron wills because nobody else makes a 250 grain broadhead. So that's my theory there. By week, use Kimsha. And when you are using Kimsha, this so it's a hot melt. It's a glue alternative where you can, it's like crazy glue. You heat it up, take your inserts out, heat it up to put it in. It makes it so that you can adjust your arrows. This is an easy way to damage your arrows if you don't know what you're doing. So the best way that I've heard to do this is you take a pot of boiling water. You heat it up, stick this in there, use pliers or a vise if you can, pull it straight out. If you really want to get crazy, stick your arrow in a cup of cold water. So that's something you can do when you're taking it out as well as when you're putting an insert in. So make sure you don't, waste money by blowing up your arrows that way, damaging the front of your arrows. It is a great way to be able to use the same arrows that you got over here to bear shaft tune with these techniques over here. One of the more common recurve weights that I see going out of here is going to be the 30-pound Samick Sage, 30-pound Galaxy Ember, something like that in the entry-level bow category. And just to give you guys just a real simple example of how we choose an arrow for that bow, can't screw it up. Look at the chart. Let's say we're selling a 30-pound bow. We need to figure out what arrows we're going to use. 30-pound bow, follow it over, 700 spine arrow. So this would be a good example of what we're going to be setting them up with. This is a gold tip Warrior. Let me see here. There we go. And this is standard components. So you just got a regular aluminum insert in there with a 100 grain field tip. Now this is a 30-inch shaft, so we do kind of wiggle around with this a little bit. For me, I have seen them fly very well just out of those 30-pound bows. So this chart isn't perfect. It's meant to be general, but that's kind of how I would follow this to get an arrow out of it. So then you're gonna wonder, what if I'm shooting a 35-pound bow? The answer is I would put you in the exact same arrow. And now that follows my bi-week use Kimsha policy. You're shooting 35, technically that would put you into a 650 category. That's why we like to buy week, because you end up, getting good with that arrow, that poundage of bow. Well, after using Kimsha, take out your arrow, or take out your insert in there, cut the arrow down until your bare shaft groups are touching where your fletched arrows are. So general, it's meant to be able to play with. So it's meant to be able to lead you to that bare shafted arrow down the road. So 35-pound bow, I would end up going with a 700 spine still. So if you were led here by the video of Joe's recurve setup, we are going to kind of track the progression of his arrow, and it is a lot more complicated than that beginner setup that I just kind of showed you guys. Right off the bat, he is shooting a 45-pound recurve. That places him at a 550 spine. Now, up front, he has 75 brass and then 150 grain tip. So he has 225, which for me is, so let's call it 75 brass. That's going to bump you down to here. 150 tip, so that's going to be probably, right around the 400 mark. Then he's shooting a springy rest. So that is going to make him be able to, it's going to allow him to shoot a little bit of a stiffer arrow. So that's going to go +1 in stiffness. We're talking about, somewhere around a 310, 320 dynamic spine. There is a lot of variables this. Now introduce the cat whiskers that he has on his string, which is going to slow that bow down just a little bit. That bumps you up right to about a 340 shaft, considering all those components that he's added. And that's exactly what he got to tune. So you were able to see how it tuned out of paper. We ended up throwing a bare shaft and it tuned up pretty well. So this will work for those higher level setups too. Don't, get caught off guard just because, this is a video that's made for beginners. Use it. Okay, if it works for you, that's awesome. I have found that it typically does. If it doesn't work for you, you're back to experimenting. So hopefully this kind of helps you choose your arrows. Hopefully that helps you kind of, get a little bit of sense out of the madness that is choosing a recurve arrow. If you have any more questions, let us know in the comments. We'd love to help out. This is something that we think, we could use a lot more exposure on online as far as just information for the traditional community, especially beginners. So hopefully that helps you, and have a great day.